From the Times and the Sunday Times, this is The Story. I'm Manveen Rana. For years now, the Olympic Games, like the rest of the sporting world, have been caught up in a bitter culture war over one question. Should transgender women be allowed to compete in women's sport?
51% of this world is female, and biology actually exists.
All I've ever wanted to be is myself, and I'm just so grateful that I've had the opportunity to come here and be me.
I don't believe that transgender female athletes should be competing at the Olympic Games.
In February, the debate reached a fever pitch as Donald Trump waded in and changed the law in America, which will host the next Olympic Games in 2028.
The war on women's sports is over. Under the Trump administration, we will defend the proud tradition of female athletes, and we will not allow men to beat up, injure, and cheat our women and our girls.
This week, The Times learnt that the International Olympic Committee is about to change the rules of the competition.
I found out that the IOC's Medical and Science Director had given a secret presentation in Lausanne, Switzerland last week that was going to lead to the IOC introducing a ban on transgender women taking part in female competition.
The story today, why the Olympics could be about to ban transgender women athletes. The news that the International Olympic Committee, the IOC, might ban transgender women from all women's sport was a Times exclusive from our super sports sleuth.
I'm Martyn Ziegler. I'm the chief sports reporter for the Times and the Sunday Times, and I focus on investigations and sports politics.
Martyn, you've had an extraordinary scoop this week about the Olympics. I suppose it highlights how good your contacts must be. How long does it take to cultivate contacts like that in the IOC?
Well, I've sort of been doing this job for 25 years, a quarter of a century, going to meetings all around the world, getting to know people. Really, that's the only way to do it, to build up these contacts. I think people know me and hopefully they trust me. We can have conversations that are sort of on background and they feel that they're ready and willing to open up about some sort of fairly significant events.
How long has this question of whether trans women and men can compete in mainstream sports, how long has that been an issue for the Olympics?
There's been issues around athletes with male chromosomes competing probably for the last 15 years. When Caster Semenya came onto the scene, she is an athlete, she was raised as a girl, but she has differences of sexual development and she has male chromosomes. That was around 2010, and that was a sort of fairly sort of major issue for athletics.
Caster Semenya has totally dominated her sport. But that success has brought great scrutiny, with athletics governing body, the IAAF, deciding her genetic makeup gives her an unfair advantage over her competitors.
If you think I'm not woman enough, I'm going to show you on the track.
A slightly different but sort of related aspect came at maybe about 2018, and I started reporting on these issues around transgender women and whether they should be eligible to take part in female competition after transitioning.
And Martyn, just explain the difference between transgender athletes and those that we refer to as DSD athletes.
Yeah, transgender athletes are women athletes who were born male, perhaps grew up as boys and then transitioned at some point to becoming women. DSD athletes, such as Caster Semenya is perhaps the most famous one, they were raised as girls and they have differences of sexual development. That's what the DSD stands for. But they have male chromosomes, so they have those permanent physical advantages as well, perhaps, that you get from being effectively born male, even though they've been raised as girls and then women.
So Caster Semenya has XY chromosomes, which are usually associated with being male. Women would normally have XX chromosomes. But there are also examples of people who were born with female chromosomes but might have genitalia that appear male. And DSD is an umbrella term that covers all of those variations in sexual characteristics that don't follow typical patterns. It is a really fraught debate, and there are, emotions and a real culture war actually on both sides. So just to begin with, just set out the case on both sides. What is it that people are arguing?
I suppose that people who want transgender women to be able to compete in female competition believe that once you've transitioned, you are a woman, and that should account for everything. There's also arguments that actually, if you do reduce your testosterone, then that can have a significant impact and actually reduce your performance levels, so it's more of a level playing field. In terms of the sort of emotions and the feelings, you can understand that for people who this is such a huge life decision that they perhaps don't want to be told that, no, you can't compete in your new gender. You have to go compete as your old one, and that's difficult for sure.
And on the other side, for the women who are objecting to trans athletes being able to compete with them, just talk us through that side of the argument.
So it might be useful to go back to the 2016 Rio Olympics, where in the women's 800 metres, the top three gold, silver and bronze medalists all were athletes with differences of sexual development, i.e. they had male chromosomes. And the other runners in that final some of them were distraught actually, and saying that this was very unfair on them. And that prompted World Athletics to take this very seriously, and actually they've brought in new rules on that. And from that kind of extended into the whole issue of transgender women taking part in female competition, and World Athletics under Sebastian Coe, Lord Coe, took the decision that actually if you've been through male puberty, the rules are you cannot take part in female competition. And that was probably the sort of driving force for other sports to follow suit.
Bit of breaking news to bring you. The Rugby Football League has approved a new policy which bans transgender players from competing in the sport.
Today, the International Swimming Federation waded into the issue of transgender swimmers in women's events, banning those who transitioned after turning 12 years old.
Other sports, including football, are still reviewing their transgender eligibility policies.
Individual sports brought in different policies, which was probably a bit messy actually, because you had one sport saying transgender women could take part in international competition, other sports saying they couldn't.
There hasn't been much consistency. For the IOC, for the International Olympic Committee, just talk us through what their rules on this have been from the start.
From the start, I think they were much more keen on the inclusion side of the argument. They said they would leave it to individual sports, but they had their own guidance and their own recommendations. Initially, they said if you transitioned and you had testosterone levels of less than 10 nanomoles per litre, then you could take part in female competition. Became a fairly controversial. Campaign groups put forward their arguments why this might be unfair, because even with the reduced testosterone, there were still significant physical advantages that were fairly obvious. As a result of this pressure, they did reduce this. They halved the testosterone levels from 10 to 5. But clearly that still didn't resolve the issues, because there's lots of medical research, scientific research saying even with reduced testosterone, the sort of muscle mass advantages that you get from going through male puberty last forever. I mean, there's even some studies that it's not just going through male puberty, it's even just being born male leads to physical advantages that whatever happens, whatever testosterone you take, whatever transitioning takes place, those physical advantages are maintained through to adulthood.
So there have been different rules in different sports, which has probably just added to the confusion. Is that why the IOC has had to do something now?
I think that's caused some of the pressure. And then there was in the Paris Olympics in 2024, This wasn't a transgender issue, but this was more like Caster Semenya, where two female boxers, women boxers, who won gold medals in the women's boxing competition, were said by one of the boxing organisations to actually, they had previously failed gender eligibility tests, and actually they had male chromosomes much in the way that Caster Semenya had in athletics. That caused enormous furore, and I think that was probably the bigger driving force for the International Olympic Committee to look at this whole issue.
Remind us, going back to that match, why it caused such a furore.
Yeah, so there's an Algerian boxer called Iman Khalif. After the International Boxing Association said that she'd previously failed a gender eligibility test, she was in a position fighting opponents who I think felt scared, actually. At least one of her opponents said they felt scared because they felt that she was effectively fighting a man.
The Italian boxer, Angela Carini, who came up against Iman Khalif in the Olympics in the first round, gave up after something like 48 seconds. She said she'd never been punched so hard as she had by Iman Khalif.
You know, when her and then another boxer from Taiwan called Lin Yu Ting, when they both won gold medals, that led to lots of women's groups and other campaigners, politicians saying, you know, this situation shouldn't be allowed to arise.
And we should say that we were never told what kind of tests were conducted, and the test results were never actually published. And Iman Khalif still believes that the International Boxing Association's decision to disqualify her was a big conspiracy, in her words. There are lots of issues arising. People are questioning this. And as you've pointed out, all of that has been a problem for the Olympic Committee for a while. What's made it change now? Talk us through what happened.
So under the previous IOC presidency, Thomas Bach, who he was elected in 2013, he, for whatever reason, seemed reluctant to sort of address this head on. But things have changed since then. When Kirsty Coventry, she's a former swimmer from Zimbabwe, she's the new IOC president.
This is the first female head of the IOC.
First female head of the IOC. During her election campaign, she was saying, you know, what we saw in Paris has made her think we need to protect the female category.
I don't believe that transgender female athletes should be competing at the Olympic Games. I would like the IOC to take a stronger stance in that.
She didn't specifically state what was going to happen, but she said if she was elected, there would be a science-based review. And once that had been done, then they could make a decision. And so she announced that in June. It's been going on basically for 5 months and has finally come up with some findings. And, these were the ones that were presented to the 100-odd IOC members in Lausanne last week.
Do we know anything about how that review was conducted or who was looking into it?
So it was headed up by Jane Thornton, who is a former Canadian rower. She was appointed as the IOC's Medical and Science Director in January last year. She led this, but she didn't just do it herself. She brought in outside scientists and other experts, legal experts too, to look into this whole issue. And I think from the science point of view, it was very much looking at the research that was out there. Lots of papers have been produced. Just about all of them are fairly come to the conclusion that the advantages of being born male exist permanently. It's the first time that, to my knowledge, that there'd been this evidence-based review of all the papers that had been out there. And people who I've spoken to who in that meeting said, this wasn't an emotional presentation at all. This was very much a sort of unemotional, fact-based. This is what the evidence says. And from that, obviously, the policy is going to be shaped. There are still some legal issues, I think, that need to be covered off in the next couple of months, just to make sure that they're not going to be perhaps in breach of human rights legislation. But I think from the people I've spoken to, think that that's very unlikely.
Have you been able to see any of the presentation yourself?
No, I've not. I don't think it was. Well, if it was recorded, then it certainly hasn't been shared.
This is not a public presentation yet. This review hasn't been made public. It is still behind closed doors.
That's correct, yeah. Whether it will be published in full ever, I'm not sure. But I imagine there'll certainly be a shorter version when the policy is formally announced that they will put that out. I'd be very surprised if they didn't.
And that change in policy, the idea that the IOC will now ban transgender athletes from all female events, when will that take effect? And how big a decision has that been?
People involved in sports, I think, would have been surprised if the IOC hadn't taken this step, because I think they could perhaps see the direction of travel. Lots of people have been saying that I've spoken to, thank goodness we've got this, because we've got clarity now. This won't come into force for the Winter Olympics because they start in February, but they should be in place well before the Los Angeles 2028 Summer Games.
And what sort of reaction has there been in the last couple of days from athletes too, and transgender athletes?
I've not heard much from transgender athletes. I think they were probably not surprised, perhaps, at the turn of events. But yes, I have also spoken to the family of a British cyclist when she was a teenager and a boy, on the point of getting part of the British cycling's junior male cycling team. Didn't quite make it, but then transitioned when she was at university to become a woman. She was going to take part in elite female races, and then that provoked such a sort of furore because it looked like she was going to have faster times than some of the British women who had won gold medals in the Olympics. And actually British cycling brought in its own rules as a result of that. She and her family think that this is very discriminatory, it's wrong, and they're absolutely furious and saddened about the whole thing.
Yeah. And our female athletes, what's their response been?
Sharon Davis, the former British Olympic swimmer, has campaigned on this really for the last 7 years, and she obviously is absolutely delighted. I think her point of view, she's always said that it should just be people who are born female take part in it, and so for her this will be a victory really for her long years of campaigning.
And what does it mean for people like Caster Semenya, you mentioned, who were born with male chromosomes? Because, as you say, if this is about the advantage of being born male and people who have transitioned aren't going to be allowed to compete, what about the people who are born with a mix of chromosomes?
That is a less clear. I think this is something some sports have done, in that you can have a female-only category and then you have an open category. And in that open category, anyone can take part. So that means whether you're a man or somebody who was born male or transitioned to becoming a woman, or somebody who a DSD athlete, they would be able to take part in an open category. Athletics have taken that step, other sports have as well. So I think that might be the model for the future.
Wow, and we might see that happening across the board. Martyn, does this decision only affect transgender women who won't be allowed to compete in women's sport, or will it also apply to transgender men?
No, it shouldn't apply to transgender men, really, because if you're a woman who's transitioned to become a man, you don't have that physical advantage from birth. This is all about protecting the female category. That's what the policy is about.
Martyn, you've been telling us how the International Olympic Committee, the IOC, after years of slightly dragging their feet about the issue, have now come to a decision, which will be made public soon, about banning transgender women from all female Olympic events. Why has it taken so long?
Since Thomas Bach, the previous IOC president, was elected in 2013, I think there's been a reluctance to sort of go hard on this issue by his leadership. And I think a lot of that is due to perhaps to legal advice, and also the previous medical director of the IOC, Richard Budgett. I think he was much more in favour of inclusion, and that's why I think they went down the reduced testosterone route. So for years, that was the policy. It seemed to them perhaps that was working. There weren't huge numbers of transgender women taking part in female sport. But then, when they were faced with the issue of the boxers in Paris, that unexpectedly caused them huge problems in terms of publicity, that's for sure.
A lot of people will wonder why now. I guess I wonder whether this is all about catching up with politics. Tell us what's been happening in America recently.
Well, this has been sort of bubbling under the radar in sport. It's obviously become part of the culture wars, hasn't it? The whole issue of transgender women and using female-only spaces. And Donald Trump, of course, took that on board, spoke very, very strongly about it during his election campaign. And since he's been elected, has signed an executive order which bans transgender women taking part in female sport in the USA, and has said he would stop transgender women getting visas to go to the Los Angeles Olympics, for example.
So when the Olympics comes to Los Angeles in 2028, my administration will not stand by and watch men beat and batter female athletes, and we're just not going to let it happen, and it's going to end, and it's ending right now, and nobody's going to be able to do a damn thing about it, because when I speak, we speak with authority.
I think we've seen other politicians speak out about it. The Conservative government in the UK, they set up a working group to look into this, and they made a recommendation that sports should bring in a policy to say transgender women should not take part in female sport at elite level. Politics has been involved in this as well, but I don't think this is the IOC responding directly to Donald Trump and the Los Angeles Olympics. Clearly, it's something will be in the back of their mind. I actually think they're more worried about any repeat of what happened in Paris and the controversy around the boxers. And also, Kirsty Coventry, as a former female athlete herself, probably feels strongly about this personally.
And the IOC has come to this decision based on a scientific review. Is the science contentious?
I mean, science is never totally black and white, is it? In fact, there are scientists I've spoken to who'd say, the whole issue of gender isn't black and white either. So there will undoubtedly be people who feel that the science isn't totally accurate or is one-sided. But, these debates on science happen in every sphere of life, don't they?
So if all goes to plan with the decision we're expecting, the IOC, we think, will be banning transgender athletes from competing in women's sports from next spring. What needs to happen between now and then for that to be achievable?
Well, they need to get the legal side of it sewn up. So I think the most important thing about that is to make sure that they can say this is an eligibility requirement. This isn't just the recommendation for all the sports to follow, that this is actually the IOC's eligibility requirement. Either way, it will be enforced, because even if they say this is just a recommendation, it would be amazing if any sport didn't follow through with that ban. But I think what they would really like is to have it as a full eligibility thing. You cannot compete in female competition if you were born male. We've seen it in World Athletics have done it. So I think it's, from a legal point of view, I think it's fairly or extremely likely that they will pass that legal hurdle. They will clear that, and then they can bring in the actual policy.
And Martyn, with the Olympics, we know that for athletes, that's years and years of training. There will be people who've already been years in training for 2028. Do you think there'll be legal challenges from there, from people who were expecting to compete who might not be able to?
I think if there's a legal challenge, it's more likely to come not from a transgender woman athlete, but from an athlete with differences of sexual development, a DSD athlete, who've been raised as a girl from birth, but just happened to have male hormones. So actually, Caster Semenya went to the Court of Arbitration for Sport, and then from that to the Swiss Federal Court to challenge World Athletics policy. And although she failed at the Court of Arbitrations for Sport, there was enough in its ruling to say what World Athletics has done is potentially challengeable at a higher court. And so that's why she went to the Swiss Federal Court. She hasn't been able to overturn that ruling, but reading it, there may be space for other DSD athletes to try and take that on in the future.
If this decision does go ahead without the legal challenges, and we should say the IOC themselves have sort of said that an update has been given, the working group is continuing its decisions, no decisions have been taken yet. But if it does all go ahead, you watch the world of sport, will other organisations follow where the IOC leads?
Undoubtedly. I think FIFA is the biggest one. If the IOC just recommends rather than makes it an eligibility rule, if it just makes a recommendation that transgender women are banned, then FIFA would undoubtedly follow suit almost immediately. And I think other sports bodies would do as well, because their involvement in the Olympics is something they are absolutely desperate to ensure they retain that. And there are occasionally been years where sports have dropped from the Olympics. We've seen it with sports such as baseball, softball, wrestling have been dropped in the past and then reinstated. And so I think if any sports fears that if they don't follow the IOC's rules, they could end up being dropped, then that would worry them. So I'm sure they will take it on board.
And how much of a shift generally do you think there's been in, the perception of transgender athletes and where this debate is? It feels like it was very, very heated for a number of years. Is that cooling down now?
I don't think it is, actually. I think it's as sort of intense as it's ever been. And I'd say initially it started with a focus on elite athletes and elite sport and whether transgender women or anyone who had male chromosomes should be able to compete in female competition at elite level. I think we're now actually seeing the focus is also moving into those campaigners saying that they shouldn't be allowed to take part in things like park run or
really
grassroots sport, but saying that's unfair. Why should somebody have a park run record if they've got male chromosomes? Why should they hold the female record? It's not somebody's livelihood. It's somebody's hobby, effectively. But the feelings are now running so strong, that focus is even on sort of grassroots sport, which certainly some people I've spoken to in sport think that's very sad, and that, they want to promote inclusion where possible. And if it's not a safety issue, then surely that should be encouraged. It's become such a sort of heated argument. I think that's going to be a focus for the future too.
That was Martyn Ziegler, chief sports reporter for The Times and The Sunday Times. The producer today was Micaela Arneson, with help from Alula Hart. The executive producer was Kate Lamble. Sound design was by David Crackles and theme composition was by Mal Assetto. If you can, do leave us a review wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for listening. We'll be back tomorrow.